Alrighty then. Hello and welcome to question and answer number 141. I am your host, Panyo Basa, and this is my beverage. And we don't have a paper umbrella for it today. Ha, just kidding. It's right here. Here we go. Style and sophistication. And some of you who are not mathematicians may be disappointed to know that 141, although odd, is still not a prime number. It is 3 times 47. And before I start answering questions, I would just like to announce that I've got exciting news in that last night I found out that this beard is now long enough to braid. And I was going to have it braided by my woman before I started, but what happened was I spent a good part of the early afternoon spreading drainage gravel in certain areas of the backyard, about 2 tons of it. And my beloved woman was helping me. And even though I was doing most of the heavy lifting, still the South Carolina hot sun mixed with pollen and everything kind of conked her out. And after dinner, she hit the bed, and she's been there ever since. So I'm having to do it with an unbraided beard. I hope you'll forgive me. So we've got, I didn't count the questions, but I think we've got quite a few. We got many questions this time. So I should probably just wade right into this. And the first question was asked for the previous Q&A, and for some reason I didn't notice it when I was compiling questions. So it's the first on the list, and it's by someone calling himself Shuch, who it's really just Trzaskas who keeps changing his name. I'm not exactly sure why. Maybe in the comments you can ask Shuch or Trzaskas why he keeps changing his name, but he's not the only one. It happens. So anyways, Trzaskas says, Metallica Fade to Black is a song about a person who is in a process of awakening, isn't it? Listen to it with the lyrics, please. So I've examined the lyrics of the song Fade to Black by Metallica, and it's not about someone who's awakening. It's about someone who is about to self-delete. For example, consider this verse. Deathly lost, this can't be real, cannot stand this hell I feel. Emptiness is filling me to the point of agony. So that's not an enlightened point of view. That's someone who can't stand being alive no more. So, before I move on to the next question, I would like to point out that I was never much impressed by Metallica. Some people will criticize the lead guitar player for being lacking in creativity and so forth, but for me it's the vocalist, the singer. I'm sure he's a really nice guy and all. He just does not have a musical voice. It's like he's just speaking in tune, and it just doesn't work for me. So anyways, Trzaskas' second question is, please tell us who are not members of your Discord server, what is this drama with Tig? So on the Discord server, we had a member who went by the name of Tig, who was kind of a trolling smartass. Sometimes he would contribute positively to a conversation. Other times he'd be bragging about how drunk he got the night before, taking pictures of his favorite alcoholic beverages and posting them, this sort of thing. And finally got to the point where I warned him, if he keeps it up, I think it was New Year's Eve, I warned him, if he keeps it up, he's going to be out. And possibly he was already drunk on New Year's Eve. He just upped the ante, and so he got booted. And then shortly after that, a person who presumably is Ethiopian joined the server, but when his voice was heard, he spoke with just a perfect American accent. I mean, those of you who aren't Americans might scoff at the idea that any American accent can be perfect, but he had sort of similar attitudes with regard to certain things, so that a majority of the members of the Discord server thought that it was Tig who was trolling us and pretending to be an Ethiopian. And so he was pretty much voted out of the server. And you can see him in the comments occasionally. So there started being like this Tig witch hunt mentality, like how can you prove that you're not Tig, kind of a thing. But I guess that's enough about Tig. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Mr. Pranav. And Mr. Pranav says, how can I cope with the fact that my father is an incompetent fool? I can't move out for the next 2 to 3 years at least, so I'm stuck with him, and I just can't keep up with his bullshit that made him lose 75% of his property, and that means I also lost that much of my inheritance, and he just doesn't listen to me or my mother and sister because he's the traditional head of the house. And I believe Mr. Pranav and his father, his entire family in fact, are of Indian ethnicity. So the father, being the traditional head of the house, is probably taken more seriously than in some place like Ohio. Not that I think people from Ohio are in any way inferior. It's just it just came up at random as an example. So this is kind of a tough question. So how can I cope with the fact that your father is an incompetent fool? I mean, you really don't have any choice. I mean, you just have to accept the fact. It's obvious that you are, I mean, judging from this statement, it's obvious that Mr. Pranav is just stuck in this situation. And so the best you can do is just make peace with the situation. I mean, it is your karma from a Buddhist point of view. You have landed yourself in that situation, apparently because there are certain things you need to learn from that situation. So just being opposed to the situation and just not accepting it is a guarantee of not only of suffering, but of just the same stuff coming up over and over again until you finally work out some way of making peace with the situation. It's kind of like Groundhog Day. You get the same stuff thrown at you over and over again until you finally learn how to deal with it with an open heart and acceptance, which doesn't mean, I mean, acceptance doesn't mean that you have to be in favor of anything that anybody else does, but still you have to be able to experience it without aversion, hatred, anger, frustration, this sort of thing. So, I mean, he says he can't keep up with his bullshit, but I mean, at the same time, he's saying that he has to stay with him for another 2 to 3 years at least. So that's just, it's like self-contradictory, or it's just like condemning oneself to 2 to 3 years of misery. And even more than that, if after the 2 to 3 years, he still hasn't learned to make peace with this kind of situation. Because the two main things that you get thrown at you over and over again are the things that you love and the things that you hate. That's karma. It's like if you can't just have equanimity when something comes your way, you are making more karma when you react to that, which causes it to keep coming. So kind of bear in mind that, I mean, from his perspective, he's doing the best he knows how. And have some compassion, maybe. I mean, from the sound of it, he's not like really abusive or anything. He's just sort of mismanaging household funds and so forth. Kind of like, it reminds me of, there was a French female writer of memoirs like 100 or more years ago named Colette, whose father was kind of like this. He married a wealthy woman, and then trying to enrich her even more, he just like blew the money and lost it, and they lived in poverty, that kind of thing. And I mean, she didn't really hold it against him. I mean, she acknowledged that that's what he did, but I mean, getting upset about it really doesn't help. It just makes things worse. So just consider it a kind of ascetic practice. Just learning to accept, like, I don't know what you'd call it, like an unpleasant, uncomfortable situation. And just add as much positivity as possible. Send metta to them, and that can also change a person's heart. That sort of thing. But grumbling and being upset for the next 2 to 3 years, it's going to be more than 2 to 3 years, because you're making karma, which is going to cause it to keep happening. If not in this life, then in the next life. If not in this form, then in some similar form. So I guess I've said enough about that, possibly without providing a satisfactory answer, in which case I apologize. And I'm just moving on to Mr. Pranav's next question, which is, what do you think of the using of subliminals and those meditative waves videos on YouTube, which supposedly help you get into deeper states of mind easily? I personally think those are for normies who don't know anything about spirituality, and a serious practitioner should stay away from it. Well, I mean, I've never really had anything to do with subliminals and meditative waves videos. My woman went through a phase when we lived at the other house of just listening to some kind of white noise background, like ocean waves or like frogs croaking in a pond, things like that, which weren't necessarily meditative. I mean, she did listen to a couple of meditative ones that were just funny to me. It's like, it was like a guided meditation where you're flying to the pyramids and some sage comes up to you and this kind of thing, which, I mean, that would probably keep me awake, just being amused by it. But really, whether it's good or not depends on whether it works in your case. Like, if you have any interest at all, just to see if it works, you can listen to one of them, try to meditate with one of them, and if it helps you to meditate, then it can't be all bad. If it doesn't help you to meditate, then it's a waste of time. Or at least if you keep doing it, it's a waste of time. It wasn't a waste of time the first time because you learned something valuable, which is it doesn't work. Excuse me, I'm having nostril problems, possibly due to all the pollen I inhaled when I was outside working this earlier today. Let's see if we're recording. Yep. It says we're recording, and I'll just go with that. So, I mean, guided meditations, I've never liked guided meditations either. I mean, if you're going to try guided meditation, maybe something like Eckhart Tolle leading a guided meditation, that could possibly be helpful. But with regard to the subliminals and the meditative waves videos and so forth, the best advice I could give is just try it. If it helps, you can keep going with it. If it doesn't help, you're better off not keeping going with it. But it might help some people and not help other people. It depends. So I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from Stellar Supreme, formerly known as Libra Lam, occasionally still known as Libra Lam, and occasionally still known by a multitude of other names. And he says, have you considered setting up an outdoor pond ecosystem in your yard, like a koi pond? And yeah, that has been the plan since I moved here. We had a fish pond at the other house. I liked it very much, and I would like a bigger version, at least a deeper version for this one. And I've been telling my woman that, I mean, the next major project, now that we have spread the gravel, my next major project of interest for the backyard, after planting the peach tree and doing the gravel, dig a fish pond. So I keep kind of urging her to call 811, because in America, you call 811 and they'll send somebody for free to come and scope out your yard and put little flags where underground, like, electrical cables and water pipes and gas mains and that sort of thing are, so that you won't dig into them and destroy something when you're trying to dig a hole. So yeah, I've got it kind of planned out. It's going to be sort of kidney shaped and at least 1.5 feet deep, preferably 2 feet deep. And there's not gonna be any koi. I considered like Medaka rice fish, but they're too tiny. We're just gonna go like last pond that we had with like comet goldfish, shoemonkin goldfish, and dojo loaches. Anyone who has a fish pond who lives in a relatively warm area, dojo loaches are the way to go. They're really cool. And plants. We're going to get plants. So, yeah. Next question is from Stellar Supreme, furthermore also as well. And he says, if monks make doodles, do they destroy them after, or is collecting them okay? Well, there's no rule against monks making doodles and no rule against monks keeping doodles that they have made. So, I mean, I drew pictures occasionally as a monk. So, I mean, I didn't throw all of them away. I still have a few. So, yeah, I don't think that there's any rule against it. I mean, if you're a monk and you're seriously trying to, like, cure yourself of all attachments, then collecting doodles that you have attachment for would be counterproductive. You know, if you've got this attachment for your doodle collection, then, yeah, that would not be very appropriate for a bhikkhu. But I don't know why you would collect them otherwise, unless you're got some kind of idea, like you're having a study going, or you want to like see how your doodles evolve over the years or some such, then maybe. I'm not sure. So I think I'm just going to move on to this question. This is from Xenothoid. And the Xenothoid says, do the Burmese, Thais, Sri Lankans, and greater Buddhist world at large have cultural equivalents to humanoid monsters such as vampires and werewolves? Well, I haven't heard anything about the equivalence of vampires and werewolves when I was in Burma. In fact, there's a theory that's becoming more popular recently that the whole idea of werewolves came from a phenomenon called the Koreos, which was like the early Indo-Europeans, the so-called Aryan race, when they were spreading from like the Pontic steppes in prehistoric times. It was this tradition, I guess you could call it, of kicking out teenage boys. Like adolescent boys would be thrown out of the community and they would become feral, and they would have to live through making raids on like other tribes, at least, you know, stealing their cattle or raiding their fields, sometimes even just making all out attacks on the villages of other tribes, sometimes even taking over those tribes. So on the outskirts of the Proto-Indo-European territory, there probably were like small communities of like non-Indo-Europeans who were ruled by like aggressive, like sociopathic teenage boys from the Proto-Indo-European tribes. And it was part of like their totem that, you know, they became wolf-like. You know, they identified with wolves, which could have brought about the European belief in werewolves, sort of like a theory that I brought up possibly in the previous Q&A about centaurs, how in ancient Greek mythology they believed in these creatures that were half man and half horse, when really that idea may also have come from the first Indo-European invaders who were marauding on horseback. And the natives there, the Pelasgians as they were called, had never seen anyone riding a horse before, just like the Aztecs or the natives in Mexico had never seen a man riding a horse before. They thought the conquistadors were monsters that were part quadruped and part man, scared the shit out of them. That's one reason why a handful of Spanish conquistadors could conquer Mexico. So vampires, I mean, I assume the original vampire was Vlad the Impaler, although they had sort of a similar idea of like succubi and incubi in like ancient Rome, where that was more of like a spectral figure that would like suck the life force out of you while you were sleeping. So they wouldn't be biting you on the neck and drinking your blood, that kind of thing. But the Burmese, I really can't speak for the Thais and Sri Lankans and so forth, but the Burmese do believe in a more or less equivalent of Bigfoot. It's big, hairy, smells bad, lives in the forest, abducts people, does mean things sometimes. But they call it a Thaye, and they consider it to be a kind of ghost that can appear and disappear at will, which may explain why we've never actually caught one. Like, my woman sometimes watches these Bigfoot hunter shows, and I'm telling her they're never going to catch one. You know, before you see the show, they're not going to catch one. They're going to see some red blip on an infrared screen or something that looks like it's kind of vertical, but they're never going to catch one. Otherwise, it'd be in all the papers. You would have seen the news of it long ago. And also, the Burmese believe in witches. So a belief in witches may be just universal to the human race. But vampires and werewolves, I think that may be predominantly a European thing, unless by vampires you also include just sort of other like ghosts or some kind of spirit creatures that just kind of drain the life force out of you. Not drinking your blood like a real vampire, but just sort of draining you of your life force, draining you of your energy. That kind of belief can also be universal in the human race. And they might really exist, but that's anticipating the second question here. So I'm just going to move on to the second question from Xenothoid. Do you believe in the existence of such beings? Well, the blood-sucking vampires, not so much. Werewolves, lycanthropes, humans, that go back and forth between human shape and wolf shape. It'd be very rare. I don't think it would be necessarily associated with the original belief in werewolves so much as you'd have like shamans that were highly adept that maybe could like project some sort of creature. Like I was watching some show, it was like a paranormal show near Skinwalker Ranch. It wasn't at Skinwalker Ranch in Utah, where there were like Navajo shamans that could shapeshift into like a big dog, that kind of thing. And whether they're like projecting some like an apparition of a dog that goes out and does things, or at least has eyes and ears that the shaman can access, or whether the shaman himself can change shape. I guess Grandpa on the Munsters could do that too. That might be before the time of most of the people who watch these Q&A videos. But I mean, anything is possible. So I'm not going to just say that there's never been any kind of shape-shifting human that could adopt animal forms. Anyone who's read the oldest extant novel in Western literature, which is The Golden Ass by, what's his name, Apuleius? Shape-shifting witches. She would rub herself down with some sort of ointment and adopt the form of like an eagle or something and go off and do her business and then come back. And then this Apuleius guy, he wants to try it himself. He's messing around with the slave girl of this witch, and she gets him some of this ointment and she spreads it on him. It turns him into a donkey instead of the eagle because she messed up and gave him the wrong ointment. So there's been a belief in humans shape-shifting into animals, and maybe vice versa. I mean, since ancient times, but whether it's actually happened or not, I don't know. I really can't say. I've never actually met one of these people. But it wouldn't surprise me. I do think that, I mean, the so-called laws of physics can be broken, and just anything is possible. But with vampires, I'd be a little more skeptical. And with regard to something like Bigfoot, universal throughout the world, there's people believing in something like a Sasquatch. So I don't think that a Sasquatch would be some sort of primate mammal. I do think that it would be a paranormal phenomenon, but belief in them is just around the world. And it's not one culture like American culture just sort of promulgating this belief. The Burmese have believed in Thiye since before they ever heard of America, I'm sure. So some beings, I think, are more likely than others. I'd be extremely surprised if there were any wild centaurs now or in the past. But maybe some, like Bigfoot, that are just sort of like coming from a bleeding through into our version of reality from some other version of reality, that kind of thing. I'm open-minded on the subject, although I've never actually met a Sasquatch. So I'm going to move on to Xenothoid's third question, which is a surprisingly difficult question. His question is, what was your greatest encounter with evil in this lifetime? And I'm just drawing a blank. I mean, I've met like sociopathic people, but whether a sociopath, just a completely ruthless person who doesn't give a shit about anybody except himself, would be considered really evil or not. You know, it wasn't like cruelty, you know, like enjoying messing people up. It's just that person has something I want, so I'm taking it. And that person's in my way, so I'm going to knock them out of my way. That sort of thing. Schopenhauer wouldn't consider that kind of person to be evil. They're just selfish and ruthless and amoral. So, evil. I mean, like cruelty, if I think of cruel people that I've met in my life, it's like girlfriends like when a woman gets pissed off, she'll just say the most hurtful, cruel stuff she can think of just to get back at you. But I mean, a pissed off girlfriend isn't necessarily evil either. So I'm really, I don't know. I mean, I've met like Burmese secret military police that probably have arrested people in the middle of the night. They didn't know what they'd done. They didn't care. They might be totally innocent. They might know that they're totally innocent. They just snatch them and they disappear them. They wind up possibly in some torture chamber. That kind of stuff happens in Burma, or at least it used to, within relatively recent times. Probably, possibly happens in America too. Not very often, I hope. But it can happen. So, my greatest encounter with evil. I mean, I'm just drawing a blank. I mean, I'm not sure. I think maybe I've just lived a blessed life and I've been protected from just the really, just most vicious, evil stuff. I mean, I met like a Burmese general who was the governor of Mandalay division, but he looked like grandpa. He's just all smiles, you know. He's just this very, very nice guy, at least to me. He might have like the torture chambers going somewhere, but to me, he was nice. So I really can't say. It's weird. You'd think that anybody would be able to come up with something. But what was my greatest encounter with evil in this lifetime? For some reason, I just can't think of anything. So, I guess I'll just move on to the next question. This is from RPAD. I don't know if his name is pronounced Arpad or what. It's just RPAD. I don't know what that means. It's French, apparently. And Arpad says, is it a requirement for monks to teach the Dhamma? It's not an absolute requirement. Although, I mean, there are some suttas that say if a monk talks to lay people, it should not go beyond the monk just politely requesting that they go away and leave him alone. Although other suttas will say that if a layperson in good faith comes and asks you a question about Dhamma, you should answer if you can. If you consider yourself qualified to answer, then you may as well go ahead and answer, especially like on Uposatha days, full moon, half moon, new moon days that are considered sort of like the Buddhist equivalent of the Sabbath. You know, they're holier days where people take their Buddhism a little more seriously. And somebody might come and ask you to administer the 5 precepts. They want to take the 3 refuges and the 5 precepts from you. Or on Uposatha Day, it might be the 3 refuges and the 8 precepts. I used to do that almost every Uposatha Day when I was living in Burma in certain places. People would come on Uposatha Day, ask me to give them the 3 refuges and the 8 precepts, and I would do it. But, I mean, you're not absolutely required to do it. So, some monks really enjoy teaching lay people, and some monks would just, I mean, they avoid lay people like the plague. So it's kind of an optional thing that you can choose to do, although in some cases you might as well. So I'm just going to move on to Arpad's next question. Who decides if or when a monk is ready to do so, or that is to teach Dhamma or to speak to lay people about Buddhism? If you are in dependence upon a teacher, I assume your teacher would be qualified to decide whether you are ready to deliver sermons to lay people or to administer the refuges and precepts to lay people. But if you're past your 5 rainy seasons as a junior monk, you're no longer in dependence upon a teacher then or a preceptor, then you can decide for yourself whether you are qualified. And for me, when I lived in Burma, I really had not mastered the Burmese language. I could sort of hold up my end of a conversation, but I really didn't have a mastery of the language. And that gave me a pretty good excuse to keep my Dhamma talks when I delivered them very simple, very pithy, not a real long one. Just teach them basics, and it is good karma. I mean, you teach others Dhamma, at some point someone will teach you Dhamma, presumably. It may be that you learned about Dhamma in the first place in this life because you were helping other people to learn it in a previous life. At least Buddhism might agree with something like that. So, yeah, I think I answered that question. So I'm just going to move on to Arpad's or RPAD's third question, which is as follows. Are monks allowed to use and own a nail clipper? And yeah, monks can own a nail clipper. I knew this one monk he was so decadent, though, that he had 2 different nail clippers, one for his fingernails and one for his toenails. But I don't think there's any rule against that. I think in the Buddhist time, when the Vinaya rules were composed, that monks generally just used a small knife, that most monks had some small knife for whatever reason. Sometimes you just need a small knife. So they would use their knife to cut their fingernails and toenails, maybe a straight razor. If you're very careful, you don't want to cut off the entire fingertip. But yeah, it is allowable. I had a nail clipper when I was a monk. So I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from Samana. And Samana says, I understand that sharing Dhamma to others is wholesome, or kusala, and one gains merit. But does it actually have any benefit for that person who is sharing it in gaining anything in a spiritual path sense? Does this karma help him or make him get closer to the enlightenment? If this person is not enlightened yet, he doesn't even know what he is sharing to others, isn't it? Well, I mean, if there is the sutta in the Sutta Nipata, the Nava Sutta, the boats, the sermon about the boat sermon, in which the Buddha says, I mean, a monk can't help people you can't help somebody to cross a river if you yourself are just being washed downstream by it. If you can't cross the river yourself, you can't really teach other people to cross the river either. But on the other hand, you can teach them basics. You can teach them, the basics of keeping 5 precepts, the importance of telling the truth, this kind of thing. So you don't have to be fully enlightened in order to help a layperson, some simple-hearted villager or some Westerner who's very sincere, very curious, really wants to know, and comes to you. And I mean, you can teach them just the basics, because that's essentially what they came there for in the first place. So does it help in gaining anything in a spiritual path sense? Does this karma help him, make him get closer to enlightenment? Well, I mean, enlightenment is not going to be caused by karma, but karma can sort of clear the path of obstacles in a sense. So by helping others, you help yourself. By helping yourself, you help others. That was something we had to chant in Pali every morning, or every evening, I should say, at the first monastery I lived at, where I was ordained in the Tampulu tradition. By helping others, you help yourself. By helping yourself, you help others. So, yeah, it is a wholesome thing to do, and it is going to help sort of smooth your spiritual path if you're helping others, not just like going completely overboard and spending your whole day like teaching English to foreign monks, you know, Asian monks, this kind of thing. I mean, that's going to detract from your practice, but just a little bit every now and then. I mean, the best way of teaching is through example. So there is that too. Well, let's see. I understand sharing Dhamma to others is wholesome and one gains merit, and that is true. But does it actually have any benefit for that person who is sharing it, gaining anything in a spiritual path sense? Well, I mean, having somebody teach you can be fundamental to your spiritual path. Usually, if someone enters upon the spiritual path, it's because some teacher has enlightened them in a relative sense with regard to the need or even the option of living a spiritual life. That's what happened with me when I was a teenager. You know, it's you don't even really have it as an option if you've never heard of that sort of thing before. And then I was a troubled teenager, got sent to this youth counselor. The youth counselor was a wise man, and he started giving me books by Ram Dass to read. He also gave me Illusions by Richard Bach, which I read, and it just like opened up a whole new world to me. So it can definitely be helpful in a spiritual sense. And I mean, it might be varying levels of advancement. You know, it might be like at a basic level, but even that, like when you're first starting out, that's important. So I would say, yeah, that's my answer is yeah. And so I'm going to move on to the next question. This is from Master Poe. And Master Poe says, was the now infamous ivermectin a medical staple in Burma? 3 question marks. And actually, I'm unaware of ivermectin being a medical staple in Burma. But a medical staple in Burma is chloroquine, which is another one of these like unorthodox medicines used in treating the Wu flu. And chloroquine was like a state-of-the-art malaria medication, like back in the 1970s. But the thing is, the trypanosome, or the malaria protozoan, it's kind of an interesting fact that malaria is not caused by a virus or a bacterium. It's caused by a protozoan that is like parasitic on your blood cells. And they have like a 2% mutation rate. It's just built right into them, this organism, that they mutate really fast. And so they get to the point where they can tolerate malaria medication fairly quickly. So chloroquine is almost obsolete. It's almost useless as a malaria medication now, because there are so many strains of malaria that can tolerate chloroquine. But still, like the village medical officers might still be handing out, you know, cheap, free chloroquine just because, you know, it's cheap and there's lots of it. And so, you know, there might be a 50-50 chance that it'll actually help with the malaria, but a 50-50 chance is better than a 0% chance. So what the hell? I never heard of ivermectin, but I came across chloroquine a lot, which is kind of the same level of controversial in the West, because both of them were medications that were mainly used for other things that just happen to have beneficial effects with regard to dealing with like the Wuhan flu. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. And this is from Siddhartha Lohachita, who previously was known as La Infamia. And Lohachita, I'm not exactly sure why this person calls himself or herself copper mind, because Loha means copper. Sometimes it can just mean metal in general, because I guess copper was one of the first useful metals that people used, and so they came up with the word for that, and then it just sort of like became used for any kind of metal. But technically in Pali, Loha mainly means copper, and Chitta, of course, means mind. So Siddhartha Copper Mind says, don't you think that some Asians who are of Buddhist origin, or at least from older traditions than us Westerners, sometimes look down on us or treat us like converts? And then Siddhartha, I'm guessing he's a guy. He has like some commentary here. It says, for example, I remember attending pujas or Tibetan Vajrayana retreats with my mother when I was a teenager, and the lamas would constantly put up a kind of barrier between them and the Westerners. They were always saying things like, you Westerners who don't understand Buddhism. It's like they refuse to believe that someone else could truly understand the Dhamma, and especially new Buddhists, so to speak. Yeah, I encountered a lot of that in Burma, and it was mainly like people of high social status and people with like university educations that were kind of haughty, and they just assumed that all foreigners were just like ignorant with regard to Dhamma. And so I could be like a senior monk, and I'd have well-intentioned Burmese people like from the city with like college educations, maybe they're like a high school teacher or whatever. They'd be trying to teach me the absolute basics of Buddhism. You know, they'd be trying to tell me how to meditate. They'd be trying to explain to me who Mahasi Sayadaw was, who at the time was the most famous monk in all of Burma. I mean, he had passed away by then. He passed away around 1980, I think. But you know, they're trying to explain to me this stuff that was just really basic level, ABC level, you know, Buddhism 101 stuff. And you know, it wasn't like they were being deliberately insulting, but they just assumed that all foreigners are ignorant. In fact, they didn't even apply it just to Westerners. They even thought that like the Thais were just ignorant. In fact, a lot of Burmese people don't even know that the Thais are Theravada Buddhists too. They just think that they're Mahayana Buddhists. That the Burmese are very chauvinistic with regard to their own ethnicity, and they think, you know, the Burmese are essentially the only people who can really correctly understand Dhamma. I once told a Burmese high school teacher this, that the Burmese think that, you know, only Burmese people can understand Dhamma, and she just heartily agreed. You know, that's right. And like Pa Aut Sayadaw also, he used to say all foreigners have wrong view. So it's a kind of ethnic pride thing, I think, that the Burmese think that they've got a monopoly on true Dhamma, and they don't even know that the Thais right next door are Theravada Buddhists, at least a lot of them. But that's like the higher social status and higher education Burmese, like the upper classes are like that. The humble villagers, a lot of them just thought I was just a fully enlightened being. You know, they're very humble, very sincere, very non-judgmental with regard to anybody really, unless maybe they think they're a witch or something. So yeah, it's mainly among the upper classes in Burma where they think that foreigners just can't understand Dhamma. They've all got wrong view. Sometimes it was kind of funny. Sometimes it was just sort of, I don't know, maybe a little bit irritating. You know, sort of like this, people talking down to you. You're like a senior monk and they just assume. Even my own, not my preceptors, my sponsors, they were very upper class. In fact, the brother of one of my sponsors, they were husband and wife, the brother of one of the male went to Yale Medical School. He was a Burmese person, born and raised in Burma, still living in Burma. He came to America to Yale because I mean they were just like astronomically wealthy, troop of servants. The wife told me that she was having to learn how to drive because when she was living in Burma, she never had to drive anywhere. The chauffeur just took her wherever she wanted to go. And they were just continually just assuming because I'm a Westerner, I couldn't possibly know Dhamma. And also the Burmese are very dogmatic. So to the extent that you deviate from orthodoxy, like to the extent that you deviate from Abhidhamma and the commentarial tradition, to that extent, you're ignorant and wrong. And so they're just continually, you need a teacher. You ought to find a teacher. You need a teacher. You ought to find a teacher. That was like the common refrain. And even when I had a teacher, they had their favorite, they were followers of the Mahasi tradition. So they were like urging me to find a different teacher who was in this tradition that they, in their wisdom, considered to be, better. Eventually, I think they just got fed up with me and washed their hands of me in disgust because I just wasn't playing along. So, yeah, my answer to that question is yeah. Next question is from Thought Fog, and Thought Fog really just totally crossed the line and asked 5 questions. And the 5th question I didn't even bother to record because really the limit is 3. And I really haven't even come up with a special list for people to ask that many questions. And I'm going to have to blow my nose for a second. Just a minute here. Bear with me. I'm not going to edit this out like a lot of these fancy YouTubers. They cough or they sneeze or they immediately start scratching their behind on camera or something. They'll just edit it out. Not me. Okay. Make sure that the mustache is safe. So anyways, getting back to Thought Fog and his totally excessive number of questions, the limit is 3. But I don't know how I'm feeling here. I'm kind of ambivalent, but some of the questions are interesting and easily answered. So what the hell this time? We'll just make this a 4-hour long one, break a new record. So Thought Fog says, what types of meditation were you up to when you were living alone in a cave? What year was this? I am so very interested. Well, my years of living in caves started like in 1993 and extended up until around 2018, I guess. 2017 or 2018. I was living in caves like most of the time that I was in Burma during that time. There were several of them. One cave I lived in for, several years. I can't remember exactly how many years it was. But it's the one place I've lived longer than any other place in my life was this cave in central Burma. So let's see here. What types of meditation were you up to when you were living alone in a cave? What year was that? I am so very interested. Well, mainly, the main meditation I did as a junior monk was Anapana, mindfulness of breathing. And I would try to do it just mindfulness of the touch of air at the nostrils. Because according to Orthodox Theravada, feeling, Vedana, like the touch of air at the nostrils, is an ultimate reality, whereas breathing in, breathing out is not an ultimate reality. So even if you don't accept Abhidhamma and the commentarial tradition, still, by being aware of the touch at the nostrils, you're closer to reality than just coming up with a concept of breathing in, breathing out, breathing in, breathing out. And I tried to note as little as possible. But then as I got better at meditation, I was able to get into deeper and deeper levels of meditation. I started having what I called 4 gears. Like in my cave journal, I would talk about, started off in 2nd gear, moved up to 3rd, tried 4th a little bit, wasn't working, went back to 3rd, that kind of stuff. And so 1st gear was just like desperation mode, like when your concentration is shot, you can't keep your mind focused very well. It was concentration it was like touching. And I'd be sitting there with my thumbs together. Let's see how I'll make it look good. There we go. It's balanced out that way. Just, I'd I'd be noting the touching of my thumbs together. And it's kind of a good meditation because, if it becomes too subtle, you can just press harder. And if it starts to become uncomfortable, you can just, relax the pressure. You get the pressure just right. And it's been a while since I did this, but I would be just noting, touching. And then any kind of distraction that would come up, then I would label that, and then go back to labeling, touching. That's like kindergarten level meditation, at least from my point of view. So there were certain things that I wouldn't label, like the touch sensation at the nostrils. We're getting to second gear, and like swallowing my own slobber, that sort of thing, or just hearing in general, I wouldn't necessarily label that. But as a beginning, like a elementary meditation technique, you do lots of labeling because it's giving your mind busy work that keeps it meditating instead of just wandering away. So second gear was usually like where I would start, and that would be anapana, mindfulness of breath. I wouldn't label the breath, I'd be watching it, noting it silently. I wouldn't be giving labels to that. I wouldn't give labels to swallowing my slobber. I wouldn't give labels to hearing necessarily. But anything else that came up, I'd still label it. It's like you just start remembering something, you just note remembering, and then you go back to the touch sensation of the nostrils. You hear a noise and you start wondering what the noise was. It's like wondering, go back, your knee itches, you're just itching, go back to the primary object. So that was second gear. Third gear was, I learned third gear accidentally, although it's an established meditation technique, even in Theravada. That third gear is like, you imagine that you're in a library with a scary librarian lady who's like really big with the flowery dress and the cat eye glasses on the chain and like the beehive hairdo, the stereotypical scary librarian lady. And you've got like a loudspeaker hooked up to your mind, so that anytime you start thinking, it just blasts through this library, and the scary librarian lady is starting to get pissed off. So essentially what you're doing in third gear is you're just watching your mind intently, waiting for the next thought to arise. And you can try this in the privacy of your own home. Just do that. Just watch your mind. Just first you kind of calm down, settle down, and then you just watch your mind intently, waiting for the next thought to arise so that you can catch it as it arises. And you may find that nothing arises for quite a while. Like watching for the thought to arise, going with materialism, it's like it uses the same part of the brain as the actual thinking. So just watching, waiting for a thought to arise, it like suppresses thoughts. And so if you get good at it, you're just watching intently. You're just sitting there in silence without thinking. So that's third gear, but it's only third gear because it still requires deliberate effort. Fourth gear would be like what the Catholic priests, the contemplative like monks of like the Carmelite order would call contemplation, where you're just sitting there empty. It's you're not even making an effort anymore, other than if a thought starts to arise, you just note it, you're just aware of it. Your attention goes to that. Not even necessarily focusing on it, but just you're aware of it, and then it just fades back out again. So it's just sitting there like in silence and emptiness. But I wasn't always able to do that, not even when I was like going for it full blast as a monk. So that was the long answer. The next three questions, including the transgressive fourth one, will be a lot shorter to answer. Would you recommend any meditation techniques to a daily Zazen practitioner? Well, if you're doing daily Zazen, I assume you'd either be working on a koan, especially if you're into Rinzai Zen, or you'd be doing Shikantaza, which would be like third gear from what I was doing. Shikantaza, again, you're just kind of silently observing the mind And that power of observation just kind of keeps the mind still and quiet, at least relatively speaking, based on my kind of shaky understanding of shikantaza. So, yeah, I mean, if you're doing daily zazen, I assume you'd be doing some kind of Zen meditation, which I would guess would be working on a koan. Did I say a mantra the first time? Working on a koan, or doing shikantaza. So I'm just going to move on to Thought Fog's third question. What are some good similes from the Pali Canon? Some of the best similes come from the same sutta, which is the Alagad Upama Sutta of the Majjhima Nikaya. That's where the simile of the raft is, where, you got someone who wants to cross this flooded river, and there's no bridge, there's no ferry boat, so they just grab a bunch of sticks and vines and grass and this kind of thing, just tie it all together, and then they just get on the thing and they just paddle it across the stream, across the flood, and once they get to the other side, they just ditch it. They don't need it anymore. It'd be foolish for them to just take this thing, which is made up out of like rubbish, debris anyway, and then just like put it on their head and continue on their way. It'd be foolish. You don't need it anymore, so you leave it behind. And the Buddha compared that raft or that float to Dhamma, that you don't need Dhamma anymore after you have become enlightened. So that's an interesting simile. Another simile from the very same sutta is the water snake. It's presumably a kind of poisonous snake. I'm not sure if anyone knows for sure what kind of snake it is. I'm not aware of poisonous water snakes in Burma. There might be one. Like in America, you've got the cottonmouth moccasin, which lives in the water and is very poisonous. But I'm not sure in Burma. But anyway, excuse me. The Buddha says that becoming a monk or being a monk is like holding this poisonous snake. And if you're, a bad monk would pick it up by the tail or pick it up by the middle. It's like the snake is Dhamma. And if you grasp Dhamma wrong, it can come back and get you. It reminds me of a saying among Roman Catholics that it's easier for a monk to go to hell than for a layperson to go to hell, because a monk is held to a higher standard. And that's kind of what this simile is getting at, where if you're a good monk, you're going to be holding that snake right behind the head, so it can't just turn around and bite you. And that's like being a good, conscientious, careful monk, and not just this careless monk who's just going to, take up Dhamma in this careless sort of way, be a sloppy monk, be a bad example, bring the Sangha into disrepute and all that you're better off just not being a monk than to be a bad one, or like an unconscientious one, a lax one, a shameless one. And I might have to blow my nose again. It's weird. This happens when I talk for prolonged periods of time after like inhaling large quantities of pollen or whatever. Golly. Check the mustache again. So, yeah, those are two of my favorites. Another simile is the thorn, the sala, or it's like the spike. I think I usually translate it as the spike. Any kind of sharp, pointy implement can be called a sala, like a surgeon's probe in ancient India was a sala. The quills of a porcupine were a sala. And the sala is like this thorn that sticks in your heart. And it's symbolic of unenlightenment, where it's this thorn in your heart that makes people just run in all directions. They just can't be comfortable and relaxed and satisfied. They're just this restless dissatisfaction that just keeps driving them through samsara. And so the enlightened person is plucking this spike out of their heart, and they become at ease. And one more of my favorite similes is found in the Atthakavagga more than once. It's found throughout the suttas, found in the Dhammapada, for example, is of the lotus flower that, it grows in like a muddy ditch. You've got this lotus flower coming up out of the mud and muck, and lotuses have it's like a sort of like Teflon, some natural Teflon on their leaves and their flowers. It's like a non-stick surface. So water and mud just do not stick to this thing, even though it's growing up out of the mud. It's just pristine. It's pure, especially if it's a white lotus. So that's a simile of how the sage lives in the muck of this world. He's surrounded by muck, surrounded by the mud of samsara, but it just doesn't stick to him. It just falls right off. You can splash a lotus with water. The water just beads up and just drips right off, and it's perfect again. So, fourth transgressive question from Thought Fog. Do Theravada monks talk much of Zen patriarchs? Maybe a few Western monks do. Burmese monks are absolutely clueless with regard to much of anything beyond Theravada. They wouldn't know. Most Burmese Buddhists wouldn't even know who Ajahn Mun was or Ajahn Chah. Some of the monks would know. But, the Burmese villager who's just been born and raised into Buddhism just listens to the sermons of the village Sayadaw. They wouldn't know anything about Zen Buddhism or Zen patriarchs or any such thing. So, considering that was the fourth transgressive question, I just answer it very briefly and move on to PSA. And PSA says, if you were to hierarchically stratify your daily operations of industrial lifting apparatuses under OSHA regulations, would you use a multivariable polynomial regression model or a tachyonic destabilization diagram with pallet positioning, on the x-axis? Well, obviously anyone would go with the tachyonic destabilization diagram. Although, it may be that some conservatives wouldn't like the tachyonic destabilization diagram simply because tachyons are a hypothetical subatomic particle that moves faster than the speed of light. But they're stupid. So I'm just going to move on to PSA's next question. If you had to live in any of these places, which one would you pick? Mount Pleasant, Bridgeport, Connecticut, Death Valley, the Vatican, or Rock Hill? Well, Rock Hill is the closest to here. It's in kind of upstate South Carolina, northern South Carolina. And I've always been interested in that part of South Carolina. So I'm going with Rock Hill. I wouldn't want to live in Death Valley. I came close to that in some areas of central Burma, just a blazing furnace. The Vatican's really not my bag of tea. Bridgeport, Connecticut, I don't know. My sweetheart says that she's been there before and it was nice. So that was kind of an option, I guess. Mount Pleasant is like a suburb of Charleston, South Carolina. So at least that's in the state. But he doesn't say that it's Mount Pleasant, South Carolina. I think there's more than one Mount Pleasant. But it's on the coast. It's really muggy and humid there. I'd rather be up in the hills. Let's go with Rock Hill. So, PSA's third question, which is actually a Buddhist question. Which Buddhist sutta or Nikaya or text would you recommend to a person who's totally new to Buddhism and they're asking about it? And my nostrils are still acting up. Maybe I should have had my adenoids taken out when I was a kid. Just a second. I don't know if this is even helping, like the nose blowing stuff. It just seems like it's the only thing I can think of doing to get me to be able to make certain sounds without like something up high up in my nostrils just kind of like closing like a valve and causing me to be unable to make that sound. So, getting back to PSA's question, which Buddhist sutta or Nikaya or text would you recommend to a person who's totally new to Buddhism and they're asking about it? It would kind of depend on like what they wanted to know. But if it was like if they want to know what Buddhism was originally intended to be like, Sutta Nipata, I'd have them read the Sutta Nipata, because that is like primordial Buddhism, or as close to primordial Buddhism as you're going to find in the texts. It's like what early Buddhism was like. It comes closest to what the philosopher Gautama of the Shakya clan was teaching. Although on the other hand, if they want to know more of, what are like the basic doctrines of Theravada Buddhism. The Majjhima Nikaya would probably be more their speed. I think more people would recommend the Majjhima Nikaya as an intro to Buddhism than the Sutta Nipata. Also, just with regard to wisdom and like interesting reading, the Udana also is good reading. There's a lot of famous suttas in there that most people didn't even know. Most people don't even know are famous Buddhist sutras, like the blind man and the elephant. That's in the Udana. I mean, most people wouldn't even know that that was like an early Buddhist teaching, but it's in there, including some of my favorite suttas, some very profound ones. So I think I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Fred. And Fred says, in your opinion, does the mind stream have log jams? And that's kind of an interesting question. And I'm not exactly sure what he has in mind. But I was thinking about it, and it would seem that like your karma would have like cataracts, there'd be like bottlenecks, like I guess it'd be like a log jam where, for example, you're a complicated person, got all these interests and so forth, different aptitudes and talents and all these things going on in your mind, and then suddenly after you die, you take rebirth as a fertilized egg, as this embryo, in which you're not going to be thinking at all for quite a while until your nervous system redevelops, not at least not at the level of this embryo. So that from an orthodox Theravada Buddhist point of view, that would be a kind of logjam to like the momentum of your mental states, your karma, because, it's going to have to wait. It's going to be waiting until, you've got enough of a thinking apparatus going that you can actually start thinking again, start having complexity of mind and start working out karma again, because a zygote, some little clump of cells in a woman's uterus, isn't going to have much karma going on. Also, just being unconscious would be similar to that. Just assuming that you don't have mentality and karma and stuff working out at some other level other than this physical level. So, I mean, at the level of the human individual, it would seem that there are certain log jams, so to speak, although at a higher level, maybe not. So I think I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from Philalethes. And Philalethes says, do you think a humble Zen-like skepticism of all human systems of knowledge, like that of Michel de Montaigne, I don't know how to pronounce French names, is a wise way to live? Yeah, I mean, humble skepticism, yeah. I mean, you don't want to just reject everything, reject any idea because you can't prove it, because you got to go with something. But still, like a humble skepticism of just not being sure, just accepting something as a working hypothesis, like a really good scientist, not the scientists who are just sold on scientism and think that science is really explaining reality, but someone, a follower of science in the sense of scientific method, where you go with a theory. First, you have a hypothesis. Then, if it seems to it's like passes the tests of these experiments that you design, it may, advance to the level of a theory, but that's it. I mean, there is no settled fact in science. It's hypotheses, theories, data that itself is sort of, I mean, you can't just assume that the data is ultimately real either. A lot of scientists do, because they're followers of scientism, but still it's just kind of a hypothetical model, like a theoretical model for explaining certain things that you can't really insist that it's gospel truth. Once you start insisting on something being gospel truth, you are, from a Buddhist point of view, a fool. The stereotypical fool in the Pali text is the person who says, only this is true, anything else is wrong. Referring, of course, to their own preferred philosophy or religion. So, yeah, my answer to that question is yeah. And I'm going to move on to Phil Lathy's next question, which is, do you like Buddhist art? And what's your favorite style or work? Well, Burmese Buddhist art is not very good. There are some really beautiful, like Buddha images, but there's probably even more that are ugly. And the Burmese are not a particularly artistic people. It's like the only aesthetics that the Burmese Buddhists really have developed is, one, that they have really innovative, creative ways of signing their name. You know, it's not just writing out your name. It's like this weird doodle or squiggle or something that, I mean, sometimes it looks fascinating. You wonder how they ever came up with that. And also, the girls know how to look pretty. And that's about it. I mean, most Buddhist artists, I wouldn't even call them an artist. They're more of an artisan. You know, they learn how to crank out some kind of painting, some kind of statue from their teacher, and then they just keep cranking them out. And there's almost no creativity. Even the songwriters are like this. There's not much imagination or creativity involved. But I mean, some Buddhist art I like. You know, I couldn't name like an artist who specializes in Buddhist art, but I think the one piece of Buddhist art that really stands out in my memory, possibly not for a very good reason, is there was a Thai monastery near the city of Seattle, Washington. I stayed there for about a week, and on the wall in the main, like the parlor, I mean, most monasteries, Buddhist monasteries in America, or a great many of them anyway, are just houses in the suburbs that get bought and just converted into a monastery because monks live there. So you got like the living room of this monastery, and there's this picture on the wall of the Buddha in meditation. Or actually, he's not the Buddha yet. It's like the eve of his meditation. He's sitting under the Bodhi tree in meditation. I think his eyes are open, and Mara's 3 voluptuous daughters are trying to distract him from his meditation. And I think it was good that the Buddha didn't have his eyes closed, because then you could say, well, he doesn't even see them. You know, how are they going to distract him when he's not even looking? But when his eyes are open and you've got the painting, it was a Thai painting, I assume. It was in a Thai monastery. These women are just like perfectly goddess-like in their voluptuousness. You know, they're just like dancing and stuff. And the Buddha is just sitting there, his eyes open, but he's just completely unmoved. You know, he's just in this state of utter detachment, and he doesn't give a damn. Or at least that's the impression that you get from the painting. And it was a very well executed painting, very well painted. I think the Thais are more aesthetic and more artistic than the Burmese. Although Burmese women are prettier than Thai women. I'm sorry to disappoint you Thai ladies out there that probably aren't watching this anyway. But yeah, I mean, it would be like an object of art by object of art basis that I would judge Buddhist art. And sometimes you can see paintings from the like scenes from the life of the Buddha, and it's kind of like a puzzle or a game where you identify the scene, you know? So I kind of like that. But yes, that's about as far as it goes. I was never really an aficionado of Buddhist art. One time when I graduated from high school, my father gave me a Gandhara Buddha head, which was a sandstone Buddha head about this big, and it had Caucasian features. It was carved in a Greek style. And I mean, that was nice. I mean, Gandhara art is beautiful because it's like in a Greek style of sculpture, which was, in my opinion, more sophisticated than most Asian kinds of art. Not that I'm just biased. I don't know. And then I was telling somebody about it later at the first monastery where I ordained. And then a little while after that, she was like the secretary for the board of directors, came up to me kind of in a confrontational manner, says, "What's this I hear about you saying that you had a gun the Buddha had?" And it took me a while to figure it out. It's like, no, I said I had a Gandhara Buddha head, not a gun the Buddha had. But I gave it to a Zen center before I renounced the world, and my father was totally scandalized by that. So, but I mean, I figured I was kind of moving around. I didn't want this priceless treasure made of sandstone that would shatter if it ever dropped and hit the floor. I just wanted to donate it to some place where it would be, revered and honored. And, just kind of sparing myself the responsibility of this thing, because I was moving around a lot, just kind of transient. So anyways, I'm just going to move on to this question. This is from Philalethes again. He says, you said your dad was a lover of frontiers. Are there still any frontiers left to be explored in the world? Well, I mean, the ocean is still largely unexplored. There's still like mental frontiers. Well, I don't know. I'm not sure about mental frontiers. There's still like technological frontiers, obviously. Like AI is crossing a frontier every day pretty much until it eventually gets to the singularity, and then who knows what the hell is going to happen. So, yeah, I mean, like what's in the center of the earth? They guess that it's like a nickel iron core or something, but I don't think they know for sure. And I got to blow my nose again because my nostrils are shutting down. Not even funny. This wasn't even happening until I was talking for at least half an hour straight. So, yeah, I'm sure there's still frontiers. In fact, probably most of the frontiers we're just clueless with regard to them. Like sort of psychic frontiers or frontiers of, bleeding through the same sort of, semi-permeable barrier that Sasquatches are coming through into this reality. That would be a frontier where the Sasquatches are coming from. And it may be you had some adept Stone Age shaman who was able to go into that realm, but it's still kind of a frontier for modern humans. So I'm sure that there's plenty of frontiers left to be explored. Maybe not so much at the material level, but beyond the material level, I'm sure there's plenty. And even at the material level, you've got the technological frontiers that are being crossed every day and making new frontiers. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Romeo. And Romeo says, have you ever read The Decline of the West by Oswald Spengler? If so, what is your impression of it? And then he continues, in his book, Spengler posits that all cultures are born, flourish, and die, and that Western civilization is now in its final phase of eventual collapse. Do you agree with Spengler's thesis, or do you think the West's demise is preventable? So I guess that's two questions. I better separate these. I don't want to be lumping my questions together. Okay. So the first question is, have you ever read The Decline of the West by Spengler? If so, what is your impression of it? I read the first half of it. I was in Burma at a monastery up in the Kulish foothills of the Shan Plateau. And I was reading a digital version of it on my computer. And for some reason, there was this glitch in the computer where every time I would add a note or underline something, it would duplicate the file somewhere where I couldn't find it, until all of a sudden I noticed that the memory on my computer was maxed out. From every time I would add a note or something, books generally don't take up much memory in a computer, but it's a big book. And every time I would underline something, every time I'd add a note, there'd just be one more Spengler, an entire tome. It's, 2 thick volumes, this Decline of the West by Spengler. So I just stopped after reading the first volume. I finally had to find out how to search for these phantom, copies of Decline of the West that weren't coming up in the Finder. If I recall correctly, I did eventually find out how to delete the extra files. But by then I'd moved on to something else. but I did read the first half of it, and my impression of it is he's way too verbose for my tastes. You know, like I said, it's like 2 thick volumes, like Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. And I mean, he could have gotten the point across way more succinctly in a much smaller book. And so I didn't like his writing style very much. In fact, I would much prefer, one much shorter work that's almost as famous, maybe even as famous, is Sir Jonathan Glubb, his The Fate of Empires. It's just an essay. You know, it's like 10 pages long. So, I mean, you can find it online. That would be a good starting point before you tackle Oswald Spengler, is Sir Jonathan Glubb, The Fate of Empires. And it's a similar kind of idea. Sir Jonathan Glubb points out that the great empires of the earth generally have a lifespan of like 200 to 250 years. But I think I might be getting ahead of myself. So that's the first question. The second question, see, in his book, Spengler posits that all cultures are born, flourish, and die. All things are impermanent. Everything that has a beginning has an end, neo. And that Western civilization is now in its final phase of eventual collapse. Do you agree with Spengler's thesis, or do you think the West's demise is preventable? And as it turns out, I had written an essay on my blog entitled, Is Decadence Irreversible? So, I mean, that would be my full answer to this question, is if you go to my blog and do a search for Is Decadence Irreversible, and read that. But I do have an excerpt here towards the beginning of my blog post, and I'll just, as by way of an answer, I'll read this. Some historians, philosophers, and other academic types, 2 of the more famous being the historians Arnold Toynbee and Oswald Spengler, have theorized that great civilizations have a natural life cycle of birth, vigorous growth, glorious maturity, degenerate senescence, and death, much as individual organisms do, and this is the natural way of things, and nothing much can be done to stop it. Furthermore, most of these thinkers have been of the opinion that our own great civilization, namely modern Western civilization, is well into the stage of degenerate decline, with collapse and extinction being our inevitable destiny in the not too distant future. Sir John Glubb, in his famous essay, The Fate of Empires, gave the natural lifespan of a great civilization at between 200 and 250 years, beginning with its rise to greatness. Oswald Spengler, although prophesying our impending doom, nevertheless was optimistic to the extent that he considered 20th century European culture to be in late middle age, still somewhat vigorous, though losing the vitality, inspiration, and suppleness of youth. He thought we still have a few hundred good years left in us, potentially, even though they would be years of decline. He considered the zenith of our culture to have been the Baroque period of the 17th and 18th centuries, with its magnificent achievements in science, music, architecture, and the kind of Enlightenment political thought that inspired the birth of the USA, and with the turning point towards decline being marked by the French Revolution and the advent of socialistic ideologies. Spengler considered his own time, the early 20th century, to be analogous to ancient Rome's transition stage from decadent republic to fascistic empire, which is a major reason why the fascists and German National Socialists liked reading his books and endorsed his philosophy. It now appears that Spengler was premature in his predictions. Mussolini, Hitler et al. May have come closer to Marius and Sulla than to Caesar himself, that is, forerunners of the death throes of liberal democracy, not the deliverers of the fatal thrust. So that's a quote from the essay I wrote on the blog. I think it's still up there. John Glubb, on the other hand, in his essay, The Fate of Empires, he points out that even though a great civilization has a lifespan of like 200, 250 years, still it is possible to hit reset. Like that happened with Rome. He has the Roman Republic as this great civilization that lasted 200, 250 years. And then Julius Caesar, Augustus Caesar came along, and there was like this reset so that you had like essentially a new civilization that lasted another 200, 250 years, although I'm not exactly sure. I think he's being kind of subjective with regard to his timing. Because the Roman Empire, I mean, it kept going for more than 250 years, although it was in decline. By the time of Constantine, it was on the downhill slide. Gibbon, in his Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, has the reign of Commodus from the movie Gladiator as the beginning of the decline. And the fall didn't happen until the Battle of Adrianople. And the fall didn't begin anyway. So it's possible you could have a reset. But whether that's going to happen in our case or not, I don't know. Because we're definitely in a state of decadence. And it's, feminism and socialism and just this progressive ideology. It's like everyone is the same and all the ethnicities are the same and men and women are the same. It's just, yeah, that is a decadent, it's just a symptom of decadence in our civilization. So what was the question though? Maybe I should go back to what the actual freaking question was, do you think the West's demise is preventable? Well, it's like the Roman Empire was close to collapse a number of times. Like during the reign of the Emperor Aurelian, you had like barbarian invasions, the Goths especially, running amok. And then the whole empire just started fragmenting into different like mini empires. You had, what was her name? Zenobia in the east. You had Tetricus in the west. It's like Tetricus had like Gaul, Britannia, and I think Hispania all just broken off from the empire. There was a few little upstarts here and there, like in Egypt. Egypt broke away until Zenobia in Syria conquered, just absorbed that part. And I mean, the empire was in fragments, but all it took was some charismatic and very skilled general and militarism to get things back together again. And I mean, it's possible. I mean, it may be that America, for example, will have its Julius Caesar. I'm kind of hoping that Trump isn't a Julius Caesar type that's going to kind of overthrow the declining system and replace it with a more vigorous one that will then just press reset for the gloriousness of our civilization. Although, I mean, the Roman Empire was pretty fascistic. It was like a totalitarian military state, pretty much. But it was glorious. Glorious monuments and all that. And I assume even that would be preferable to just a collapse into, I don't know what we would collapse into. I mean, Europe would collapse into like an Islamist caliphate probably. Because the castrated Europeans, the feminized Europeans wouldn't be able to put up much of a fight to stop it. So, yeah, I do think that the West's demise it can be averted, that you can hit reset, that you can turn things around temporarily, although everything is impermanent. So, I mean, Western civilization will eventually come to an end, and I have no idea what's going to replace it. Maybe AI. So, let's just move on to the next question. This is from Extremely Rare Bird. An Extremely Rare Bird says, have you read Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, a Holocaust survivor recounting his experience in the concentration camps? No, I haven't read any books written by Holocaust survivors that I'm aware of. The closest I ever came to that was reading Solzhenitsyn's The Gulag Archipelago, which has, I mean, the gulags were concentration camps too. They were like prison camps. And there was some pretty gnarly stories in there, but we don't need to get into that. But I have not read Viktor Frankl. So I'm going to move on to Extremely Rare Bird's second question. On a similar note, what did you think about House of the Dead by Dostoevsky, if you read it? I think it's pretty great so far. Yeah, I did read The House of the Dead. I'm pretty sure that was his more or less autobiographical account of being in a Siberian prison camp. that Dostoevsky was, he started off when he was a very young man as a socialist. He was kind of a radical, and then he got arrested and sentenced to death. And he was actually like waiting in line to be shot in front of a firing squad. You know, the first people were already blindfolded, standing in front, and he wasn't in the first wave of people to be shot, but he was standing in line, waiting his turn. And then at the last minute, probably theatrically, they get a pardon, not necessarily a pardon, but the Tsar just commuted their sentence to X number of years in a Siberian prison camp. So he didn't get shot after all. He goes to the Siberian prison camp, and he's dealing with like murderers and child molesters, just like hardened criminals beyond the imagination of the average American city dweller living in comfort. That some of these people were just utter sociopaths. And in a way, it inspired Dostoevsky's, the themes of his writing, where, I mean, he knew that some of these people were just bloodthirsty, ruthless murderers. But at the same time, he could see this inner strength that they had. And that, I mean, even like this brutal murderer, you know, they still had a kind of divinity to them, or just the indomitable human spirit or something that really struck Dostoevsky and just influenced his point of view for the rest of his life. And by the time he was back in like St. Petersburg or Moscow writing, he was just right wing all the way. One of his masterpieces, one of his great novels, probably the least of his masterpieces, was The Possessed or The Devils, in which socialists are symbolic of devil worshippers. You know, it's sort of an apocalyptic book where the leader of this socialist group, you know, he's sort of like the Antichrist. That Dostoevsky just did a 180. And it was largely caused by his experience in the Siberian prison camp, just dealing with just the utter dregs of society, because he was a political criminal, but he was just thrown in with like the violent criminals. You know, they didn't really discriminate. They didn't have special prisons or special gulags just for the political guys. They just get thrown in with the murderers and the thieves and so forth. And he just saw something like admirable through all the sociopathy, I guess it's pronounced. So yeah, I mean, it's largely autobiographical. He doesn't really write it as an autobiography. He writes it as a novel, but it's based on his own experiences, and probably most of what happened in the story really happened with Dostoevsky. It's not my favorite book that he wrote, but it's definitely worth reading. So anyways, I'm just going to move on to Extremely Rare Bird's third question, which is, do you see any likeness of our worldly conflicts today and those that led up to World War II? Well, I mean, the conflicts that led up to World War II were mainly like Germany liberating the German-speaking ethnicities of neighboring countries in the West, and Japan just trying to imitate European colonialists by carving out its own empire in the East. And I don't think either one of those is really happening now. I mean, Russia kind of is expansionist in trying to gain back its losses, so to speak, when the Soviet Union collapsed. So there is that. But on a kind of in America, there is something that's happening that was similar to what was happening in the Weimar Republic of Germany. In fact, it's happening in Europe also. It's like the Weimar Republic on a larger scale, where the Weimar Republic was kind of liberal and Weimar Germany was decadent. And anyone who watched Cabaret with Liza Minnelli, it's really a good movie. It's worth seeing. It's about Weimar Germany, how it's just sort of like a lot of like moral degeneracy going on. And what was happening in Germany at the time was the center was collapsing. Germany was polarizing. You had Marxists and you had Nazis, or I mean, you had other groups too, but still, it became like this polarized political scene of the far left versus whatever the National Socialists were. I mean, they weren't really far right. You know, they had socialist elements, hence they were called National Socialists. But, you know, I guess some people have called Adolf Hitler like a radical centrist. Because being a centrist isn't necessarily, you know, it's just like the Buddhist middle path necessarily. So that's kind of happening in the West. It's just like America is just being polarized. But you've got the Trump supporters and the people who hate the guts of the Trump supporters. Or, I mean, the Trump supporters hate the guts of the far leftists too. So I'm mistakenly calling them liberals, but I mean, they're more socialists than liberals. So the center is hollowing out and it's becoming more polarized, and you're going to have some radical group that could take over. Although I really don't think that Trump and the MAGA people are all that radical. You know, they're just returning to what worked pretty well, like in the 1980s and 90s. Like most of the positions of Trump and his administration are not all that different from what was just accepted common sense just a few decades ago. So, yeah, I mean, one of the main things that caused World War II was just the Germans were smarting after World War I, the humiliation and betrayal of like the Treaty of Versailles and all that, which, I mean, I really don't see any parallels to that nowadays. And Japan isn't really setting up an expansionist empire, although China might be. But yeah, I don't really see a whole lot of parallels. I mean, if you look hard enough, you're going to find parallels. You know, you're going to find coincidences and all this stuff that, I mean, if you build your case carefully, you might be able to persuade a number of people that, you know, it's all happening again. But yeah, I think the current situation is fairly unique. So I guess that's enough on that one. And I'm just gonna move on to the next question, which is from Rui. And we've been going for over an hour and a half already. Man, I hope I don't break any records, because I started this one fairly late. It was after 9 o'clock in the evening when I started. It's gonna be after midnight probably by the time I'm done. So anyways, Rui says, do you think Dhamma permits adoration? And he's got adoration hyphenated. It's AD-oration. I don't know if that was on purpose, in which case I do not understand the significance of ad-oration. But adoration in general, just to make sure, I looked up adoration in the dictionary, and there's two meanings. One is deep love and respect, and the other is worship or veneration. And I don't think that Dhamma would have anything bad to say about deep love and respect, so long as it's not a lot of clinging and attachment involved. But just deep love and respect is fine. It's the attachment that is often accompanying deep love, especially, that Dhamma would hold a dim view of. And with regard to worship and veneration, the more devotional type of Buddhists, I mean, it's all the way in the suttas. I mean, it's in the suttas, Pali texts. There's already like the cult, personality cult of the Buddha and adoration of the Buddha. So Dhamma as it exists today certainly permits like worship of the Buddha, veneration of the Sangha, and so forth. The earliest Buddhism, maybe not so much worship. There'd still be veneration of monks, veneration of senior monks by junior monks, that kind of thing. But I think veneration here means something a little stronger than just deep respect. So, I mean, deep love, respect, even worship and veneration are fine so long as you don't have clinging and attachment contaminating them. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Count 9. And Count 9 says, what happens if someone is practicing mindful mindlessness, listening to a Dhamma video while cleaning the bookshelves? Is that when animal talk begins? Or is it simply when we start to hear it, I guess I already know the answer. Thoughts? Well, what happens if someone is practicing mindful mindlessness, listening to a Dhamma video while cleaning the bookshelves? I mean, which one is the mindfulness and which one is the mindlessness? I mean, you can be cleaning the bookshelves mindfully and just sort of, the Dhamma talk is just background noise and you're just thinking about something else, in which case the listening to the Dhamma video would be the mindlessness and cleaning the bookshelves would be the mindfulness. So mindful mindlessness, it's like multitasking. I don't think you're going to be able to do multiple tasks mindfully. You know, maybe some kind of alien race might be able to manage it, but we mere humans, I don't think we can multitask mindfully. That you can be mindful of one thing at a time, but you can't be doing two things at a time and being mindful of both of them simultaneously. Unless maybe you can get into this expansive state that is like choiceless awareness, like Krishnamurti talked about. But I don't think Count 9 is referring to Krishnamurti's choiceless awareness here. So I don't think that's when animal talk begins, just when you start talking about worldly stuff that is of no benefit spiritually. So, yeah, I think animal talk beginning really doesn't have much to do with multitasking necessarily, or listening to Dhamma videos while cleaning bookshelves. You know, just having Dhamma videos in the as background noise. That, I mean, you're better off with that than with like death metal or something, I suppose. That Neem Karoli Baba, up on the bookshelf back there, he used to hire people to chant like Hare Krishna stuff. You know, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, just for like hours and hours every day. Just in a way, I mean, it was just sort of like this background carrier wave to all the villagers, the people living around there who could hear it. It was just like going on in the back of their mind. It's like this spiritual adoration of God that's just sort of like in their subconscious mind all the time because of this. I mean, that's not necessarily a bad thing, no matter, you know, they might be telling raunchy jokes or committing adultery or whatever while this, you know, this chanting is going on in the background. But I really don't see the connection here that if someone is practicing mindful mindlessness, is that when animal talk begins? I really don't see any kind of like statistically significant correlation there. Unless it's just mindlessness in general. It doesn't have to be mindful mindlessness, it's just unmindfulness in general. So I guess I should just move on to this question. I'm not sure how well I answered that question, but it was kind of a hard question for me to really understand very well. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from the proto-pseudo-monk, who used to be known as Cool Whip. And the proto-pseudo-monk says, did you ask your parents for permission to ordain? How did they react to the idea of you becoming a Buddhist monk? Also, how should one explain to their family and friends why ordaining is not a stupid idea and one is not throwing their life away? That's like two questions already. My granddad said, such a waste. Others have said, you have so much to offer to the world. What about having a family, etc.? Every single thing monks do, they say, is the opposite of a meaningful life. Not one person I know celebrates this idea. Well, getting to the actual first question here, did you ask your parents for permission to ordain? I just informed them that I was going to do it, and they didn't say not to. I'd already been temporarily a novice monk for 5 weeks, like a year or two before. So I'd already done it. And I think both my parents just assumed that it would be temporary and not lasting until long after both of them had passed away. And my father was proud of me. He thought I was kind of an extremist. He thought I'd gone overboard, but he was proud of me. But my mother, I mean, she, bless her heart, she did not have a religious or spiritual bone in her body. She just completely did not get it. She would infinitely have preferred to have grandkids that she could spoil rather than have a son who is a monk living in Burma with almost no communication. So I didn't really ask for permission to ordain, but I just told them that I was going to do it, and they didn't tell me not to. Although I did know a monk whose parents were like devout Christians, and they just refused to give permission for him to ordain. But he got ordained anyway. Tampulu Sayadaw ordained him and said the Sangha is willing to make the sacrifice, which means the Sangha is willing to break a minor rule by ordaining somebody whose parents did not give permission. It's still a valid ordination. It's just that the monks who ordain somebody whose parents didn't give him permission commit a minor transgression, a dukkha offense, and then they have to make confession and they're cleared of the offense. So there is that. So the second question, and I think he's asked 4 questions here because he's got a compound question with more than one question mark. How should one explain to their family and friends why ordaining is not a stupid idea and one is not throwing their life away? Well, I mean, one way I used to think about it is, I mean, you read in these ancient books that, I mean, if you do this and that, you can realize ultimate reality. You can know the highest truth. And so it's like a spiritual duty to at least give it a shot. You know, it's like, you know, putting it in Christian terms, it's like seeing God face to face. That it's actually possible to do that. You know, it might be that your odds are not all that good statistically, but at least it's possible to do that. And if it's possible to do that, I mean, why would anybody not even give it a try? I mean, it just makes perfect sense to me that if you've got these ancient texts, venerable scriptures saying that if you live your life in this way, you can realize ultimate reality. You can know the highest truth. You can liberate yourself from all suffering and delusion. I mean, why would anybody think that's a stupid idea unless they're just locked into samsara and don't know any better? You know, they just think anything that isn't like worldliness is bullshit. And there's lots and lots of people like that. But I mean, you shouldn't like shackle yourself to their very limited point of view. But even my father, who was proud of me, he thought I had really gone over. I was like some kind of radical extremist by becoming a monk. So, I mean, you have so much to offer to the world, but I mean, you can offer more as an enlightened being or a very wise one than you will from being a normie who makes a lot of money as a doctor or a lawyer or something. But a normie, like a worldly minded normie, probably would not agree with that statement. So, yeah, I mean, trying to persuade them that it's a good idea. I mean, just liberating yourself from suffering and delusion. I mean, anyone who thinks that is unworthy of a goal is someone that you're probably better off not spending a lot of time having conversations with anyway. So, I'm just going to move on to the proto-pseudo-monk's second question, or actually technically third, which is as follows. If I can get my nostrils to cooperate. As a general rule, would you advise to not cultivate relationships that have no respect for or even follow the Buddhist path? Explaining it is pointless. The Buddha said something like, "What can I say for them to go away," right? Old friends want to meet up and chat, even drink, but they live in delusional ways. I see it as a trap because I've known such persons for a long time. I feel an obligation to meet with them because they are still nice people, no harm in chatting, but from Buddhist perspective, very unethical, hedonistic lifestyle, etc. However, experience shows that due to my weakness or old habits, I always compromise my practice. One step in the direction of sensuality is like 10 steps backwards spiritually. The robes feels like the only way to protect myself from this unwholesome behavior and subsequent muddled mental states. Yeah, one thing I did was I just deliberately moved to a town where I didn't know anybody. Although sometimes my old friends would make the drive to come visit me and we'd go out and get drunk or something. But yeah, I mean, you gotta like feel out what works best for you. And I mean, as a layperson, I mean, you're just gonna have to deal with lay people. I mean, that's just unavoidable. I mean, you can choose your friends, try to choose wise friends and avoid foolish ones, that kind of thing. Yeah, I mean, I went through the same kind of thing, but I was still hanging out with my buddies up until shortly before I went to the monastery. For quite a while, I wouldn't drink. So, I'd go out, I'd be like designated driver. And it's really not much fun to be the only sober person when everyone else is acting like drunks, and you're sober. It wasn't really all that enjoyable for me. Let's see. Yeah, well, I mean, it's just your own choice that you have to make. I mean, there's a trade-off by just sort of injecting some higher consciousness into the interaction with your friends. You're actually benefiting your friends. I mean, you may be taking somewhat of a hit, but they are benefiting. And then so you're at the same time that you might be getting bad karma or making bad karma, you're also making good karma by helping to uplift these other people that you're interacting with. So it's kind of a trade-off, and you have to decide for yourself what works best for you. But like I did, I mean, you can partly deal with the situation by just avoiding people and becoming pretty much of a hermit. I mean, I wasn't a total hermit, but like I said, I moved to a town where I didn't know anybody, although an old friend of mine that'll be mentioned a little later on in this Q&A moved to town just a matter of months after I did through some kind of coincidence. Let's see. So, yeah, I mean, this is a hard one to advise on because I really don't know the precise circumstances. I mean, I went through something similar. I survived. I mean, I did get drunk with my old buddies, I mean, shortly before my ordination even. But we don't need to get into the lurid details of that. So, yeah, I mean, you can avoid people or not really. Just follow your heart and do what you think is best. And then I'm just going to move on to the proto-pseudo-monks. Next and last question, third or fourth, depending on how you look at it. Oh, this is kind of a continuation of the previous question anyhow. How did you handle social situations, non-Dharmic friendships, right before ordaining? Socializing seems useless, harmful. You no longer share the same difficulties in life. You aren't chasing the same happiness. And it's ironic because the challenges I, or a Buddhist, faces is actually amplified in these situations. You are trying to purify your mind and they indulge in impurity. It's strange, Buddhism has made me despise humans as fools a lot more than previously. I used to take drugs like shrooms, ecstasy, weed, listen to the Beatles, Bob Marley, and feel infinite love for humanity. Now it's like, what wretched, selfish, stupid creatures. Is this true? Well, it didn't really work that way for me. I mean, I always had kind of a low opinion of the human race, and it's only after I'd been a monk for many years, and I've explained this before, that I started acquiring more compassion, more sympathy for fellow humans, because I tried as hard as I could to be a saint. I realized how difficult that is. And so how is a normie who, I mean, that's not even on their radar. I mean, it's not even really an option because it just hasn't even really occurred to them. How are they going to live up to some exalted ideal? I mean, they are what they are. It's in a way, it's like dealing with animals, dealing with dogs, for example. I mean, they're way stupider than humans, at least in certain ways. They just are animalistic. They are animals. And I mean, you don't despise them as fools. They can't help it. They're born that way. And I mean, it's like we're more likely to despise humans because humans are closer to us, I suppose, because we're human too. But still, I mean, you can adopt a similar situation where you have a kind of sympathy and compassion. And certain things you don't have to compromise. Like you can always tell the truth. You don't have to start telling lies when you hang around with your old buddies. You don't have to start stealing. So, I mean, you can still remain relatively moral. But again, like I said, onto the first half of this question, you're just gonna have to feel it out for yourself and decide for yourself what is the best route to take. And to some degree, I think being very social is probably not the best route to take. But I mean, dealing with your old friends for old time's sake, out of genuine brotherly love, that kind of stuff, that's actually can be a good thing. You might take somewhat of a hit, but you're also helping to uplift them, and then you get good karma for that. So it's sort of a trade-off. But living where you don't have lots of friends is probably a good idea, especially if you're planning on renouncing the world. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. And we are getting down towards the bottom here, which is kind of good. Yeah, we're going to be way less than 3 hours. So that's kind of nice. So, I mean, those of you who like the really long ones, just play it. You can slow it down so it'll have a deeper, more resonant voice, or you can just keep watching the same one, or you can just watch old ones. I doubt there's very many people. There are a few, I'm sure, but there's probably not very many people who have watched all 141 Q&A videos, extending all the way back to when I was a shaven-headed monk. The first few of them, I'm still a monk. So anyways, next question is from Yuga-U. And Yuga-U says, in the Atthakavagga, the Buddha speaks against taking up morality and observances. Can you explain what he meant by that? Well, he didn't really say that you shouldn't take up morality and observances. There's one sutta, the Magandiya Sutta, where the Buddha says you're not going to become enlightened. You're not going to be purified by morality and observances. But on the other hand, you're not going to be purified by an absence of morality and observances. And he does warn monks not to cling to morality and observances. And that's really the main point. Like in the Atthakavagga, it talks about how there are some like philosophers and priests who will cling to a moral code, and if they fall away, they transgress the moral code, they consider themselves to be lost. They're in despair. And they think that only by clinging to this moral code are they going to have any hope of liberation. And the Buddha warned against that. He warned monks to refrain from enslaving themselves to moral codes. So in a way, it's sort of like an aspect of Christianity, like what the teachings of Paul, that I used to really have no use for at all. And that was so long as so long as you accept Christ as your savior, then you can do all kinds of stuff and you're forgiven. And I had no use for that at all. But still, there is a certain glimmer of wisdom in that clinging to a moral code is still clinging, and it's like a mental prison. And if you fall away from that, you break a rule or something, you've just screwed yourself. Whereas really just do the best you can, be as wise and as conscious as you can manage, and then just go through life spontaneously without having to, enslaving yourself to some artificial list of rules, which is kind of ironic because Buddhism eventually came up with the Vinaya rules, which is probably at least 2,000 rules that monks are supposed to follow. Although I am skeptical with regard to the idea that the Buddha actually set up this system, that it was possibly set up after his parinibbana, after his death, just to stabilize the Sangha because the leader wasn't there anymore. And if you read between the lines in the history of the First Council, that does seem to be the case, that it is implied that the First Council, which is also called the Vinaya Sangiti, it's the convocation on monastic discipline, they were setting up rules to stabilize the Sangha, to stabilize Buddhism after the Buddha is gone. So the Buddha, in the text, the Buddha says, you really should not enslave yourself to a moral code. You should be moral, but you shouldn't be attached to that. That's the main point. And the Magadhya Sutta says, it's like morality and observances isn't going to get you enlightened, but amorality and non-observance isn't going to get you enlightened either. Which is kind of hard to wrap your head around, I suppose. But he wasn't speaking against taking up morality and observances. He was more speaking against clinging to morality and observances as some kind of road to liberation. Because it really doesn't work that way. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Austin. And Austin says, I've heard you say that you don't believe gender is fundamentally real. Following this logic, could a man become a woman? Well, I mean, if gender isn't fundamentally real, how could a man become a woman? Because there would be no men and no women. I mean, there's like two levels of truth in Theravada Buddhism. There's ultimate truth, and then there's conventional truth. In ultimate truth, there's no men, no women, no people, no beings. That's all conventional truth. And even in conventional truth, I mean, nowadays, we've got the conventional truth of like scientific empiricism, which is a very, very strong model of truth. Even though it's not ultimately true, it definitely stabilizes our reality and explains things fairly well enough to get us through life in a more or less predictable manner. So, going with conventional truth like scientific empiricism, then you definitely do have male and female. And in fact, in Abhidhamma, maleness and femaleness are ultimate realities. So Orthodox Theravada, I mean, you're either male or you're female, or possibly in a few cases, you could be like a hermaphrodite. But there's no way you could switch from being male to female or female to male, or at least not through natural means. There's a few cases like, what was his name? Soraya, the story of Soraya in the Dhammapada commentary, where there's this merchant's son, a young man who's already married and has kids, and he watches this arahant taking a bath in a river, and this arahant has just this beautiful golden complexion. And this young man is thinking, man, I wish my wife had a complexion like that. And because of this profane thought about an arahant, regarding this arahant, he just immediately turned into a woman, just through paranormal, like miraculous means. And then he was just overwhelmed with shame when he realized what happens, took off, moved to Taxila, and got married and had 2 kids. And then finally, an old friend of his happened to be in Taxila on business. This Soraya recognized him, invited him into the house. He's like this, matronly woman at this point. And she's asking him about, what happened to so-and-so back in whatever town they were originally from, Sawati or something. And then finally she tells him that, I used to be your friend Soraya, and because of this event, when I had this thought against this monk, that I turned into a woman, and here I am. So then the monk said, well, did you ask his forgiveness? Did you apologize? And the woman says no, and says, well, you should. I mean, he's not far from here. Let's go and do it. So she apologizes, and then she immediately turns back into a man again. So according to Theravada Buddhism, maleness and femaleness are ultimately real in Abhidhamma, which most Western Buddhists really don't take very seriously, including me. But just deciding that you're a woman, if you're a biological male, just to decide that you feel more like a woman than a man isn't going to make you a woman. Not from a scientific empirical point of view, even though a lot of the scientists have joined the cult of progressivism, and then not according to Orthodox Theravada, and then just going with ultimate reality, there's no male, no female, no change. So, I mean, following a looser kind of conventional truth, where conventional truth is just whatever the majority believes is going to be conventional truth, even if it isn't ultimate truth, then presumably in some society or population, it could be conventional truth. And then a man can become a woman, or a woman can become a man. But even in Burma, you've got a lot of transsexual people. Just out in remote villages, you're going to have transsexual people. And the Buddhists can accept this because it's just a matter of reincarnation, and someone is transitioning from male to female, and it's taking more than one life to make the full transition. So they're like in an intermediate stage where you've got a woman who maybe recalls having been a man in her previous existence, or maybe she doesn't recall it, but still there's like, a fairly plausible Buddhist argument that they were the opposite gender in their previous existence, and they just kind of still have the like characteristics of that gender, even though they're in the body of the opposite gender. But even they aren't saying that a woman who was born and believes that she's a man, that like physically she's a man, that it's just like kind of spiritually she's still pretty much a man. But I mean, I've met some of them, and I remember asking a friend of mine, he employed one. There's a woman who went by a man's name, acted like a man, and was a very active lesbian or heterosexual trans man, scoring with a lot of kind of lesbian type women. And I asked him, what kind of bathroom does she use in Burma? When she's at the bus station, does she use the men's room or the ladies' room? And he didn't know. I asked him to ask her for me, or ask this person for me, but he never got back to me on that one. So I don't think that gender is ultimately real. It's conventionally real. And going with the strongest model of conventional truth that we have, which is like scientific empiricism, that it just doesn't work that way. You can't just decide that you're a cat. People are doing it nowadays. In fact, I've been told that in some schools, there are actually litter boxes in the girls' room for the girls who identify as cats. I've actually been told that by a school teacher. So, I mean, people can believe all kinds of stuff. And, and in kind of Buddhist acceptance of illusion, within the realm of illusion, then you could say pretty much anything goes, although it's definitely a step away from rationality and common sense to say that just because you think you feel like a woman, that you are one. And then you can just enter into women's sports and just completely dominate. So, yeah, following my logic, a man couldn't become a woman unless it was like just the conventional truth, which is failing in the West. There were a number of leftists, they're mostly still trying this, but it's faltering. It's like this woke stuff is going out of style fast. And I was like avidly following up on the reviews of the new Snow White movie that was just an absolute bomb, because they're trying, I don't know if there's any transgender stuff in there, but it was just like leftist propaganda, and it's like race swapping of some of the main, like Snow White herself. It's a brown-skinned woman called Snow White. And I don't know, it's just the attempt to make it conventional truth for Western civilization, that a man can become a woman and a woman become a man, is failing at present. It's faltering. It could make a comeback. I hope it doesn't. But there was an attempt at making that the established conventional truth of our society. And large numbers of people accepted that and still accept it, but I never did. Even if a man had a complete, a sex change operation, I don't think that would really make him a woman. Genetically, still a man. Physically, aside from some artificial changes, still a man. A lot of their psychology would still be male. So it's kind of a vague question. Ultimately, there are no men to become women, no women to become men. Conventionally, I mean, it depends on what the majority believe, but conventional truth is pretty well locked down by modern scientific, not necessarily even realism, but just scientific empiricism. So I think I've spent enough time on that. I'm going to move on to the next question, which is from Phalix, who I'm pretty sure used to go by the name of Skuladin or Skuladin. And he says, would you kindly compare Ram Dass to Jordan Peterson? And then he's got the characteristic bullet points of Skuladin, which says, Richard Alpert and Jordan Peterson led similar lives until Richard rejected the social engineering or cultural conditioning that drives the political economy because it made him neurotic. Well, I'm fairly well acquainted with Ram Dass and Jordan Peterson, not from personal acquaintance, but just from seeing them, hearing them, reading books, that kind of thing. And I never made any connection between the two. Never did Ram Dass remind me of Jordan Peterson or vice versa. That there are certain basic differences. Ram Dass started off as Richard Alpert. He was a professor in the California, like the University of California system. Then I think he went to Stanford, and then he went to Harvard. He was a Harvard professor. And he got kicked out of Harvard with his friend Timothy Leary because they were experimenting with psychedelic drugs. And after he had this kind of awakening experience, like a semi-awakening experiences with LSD, he went to India looking for some meditation master that could tell him, what is this LSD experience all about? And can you cultivate it without the chemical, just through ancient Indian meditative techniques, that kind of thing. Jordan Peterson and Richard Alpert, who became Ram Dass, I would consider him a saint. I don't think he was fully enlightened, but he was a very wise and spiritual man. I had a lot of respect for him. He was like one of my first gurus in my life. After my father, he was one of my first gurus. Jordan Peterson, on the other hand, he's still struggling. Richard Alpert or Ram Dass was kind of struggling too. He wasn't fully enlightened. He had like higher, more refined spiritual struggles. Jordan Peterson is struggling still at the worldly level. He messed his mind all up with getting addicted to Valium or something when his wife had cancer, and he can be very angry. He cries a lot. And Richard Alpert he was born Jewish, but I think Jordan Peterson eventually became more pro-Jew than Ram Dass was, just largely through his association with the Daily Wire and Ben Shapiro et al. So I think that Ram Dass was more of a spiritual figure. Jordan Peterson is not particularly spiritual, as far as I can tell, that he would greatly benefit from some acquaintance with Buddhism. He's like struggling. I went to see Jordan Peterson speak once when he was in San Jose, California, and he was struggling to try and come up with some morality or ethics that doesn't rely on God. And Buddhism has had that for 25 centuries, and Jordan Peterson seems oblivious to that he's relying more on experiments on rats than he is on Dharma. So, yeah, I think Richard Alpert or Ram Dass was much more saintly, much more wise than Jordan Peterson. So that would be my comparison. And so I'm just going to move on to Phalix, which is kind of a cringy name in my opinion. Let's just go with Skuladin. Skuladin's next question, which is, can marijuana cause existential dread or anxiety? And the bullet point comment here is I've heard this theory a number of times where people blame weed for their anxiety, but I think it's probably closer to a subconscious realization that even normies who checked every supposed to box are losing homes and cutting back on meals. Even before the COVID, I remember people living out of cars who had full-time employment. Well, let's just get back to the question here. Can marijuana cause existential dread or anxiety? And I can say from my own experience, yeah, it can. In fact, the only panic attack, or the closest thing I've ever had to a full-blown panic attack, was it was caused by smoking too much weed. I was a monk at the time. I just came back from Burma to America to visit my family. My old buddy Mucus Man, bless his heart, he's one of my dearest friends to this day, even though we haven't been communicating much because he's living on the other side of the continent. But, he smokes weed like a Jamaican. He just smokes prodigious quantities. And, I used to be able to keep up with him when I was a young man before I became a monk, but he took me camping. And he's the camp master. He specializes in foul weather camping. He can camp and build a fire in a downpour. It's all good. So anyways, after we went camping, I think it was after we went camping, I was staying at his place, and he starts handing out the cannabis, and I'm trying to keep up with him, for old time's sake. I always liked marijuana. I liked it better than alcohol. So, I'm smoking out with him, and he had this little Mexican devil mask on the wall, and it was starting to bug me. I was starting to get paranoid feelings. And finally, at one point, I asked him, "Can you take that down? I don't want to keep looking at this red horned devil mask that's on the wall." So he obliges me and takes it down. And I just got hammered. I didn't drink any alcohol, but I was just so high. For him, it was just like an average, for him, it was nothing. But I was just completely out of it. So finally, it was bedtime. I went to my room, and he went to bed on opposite sides of the place, the other end. And I kept hearing footsteps in the dark outside my bedroom, and I'd open the door and it'd be silence, nothing. And then I'd close the door and I'd start hearing footsteps again. And I'd open the door and just be pitch blackness and stillness and silence out there. And I started to panic. It's like somebody's sneaking around, they're gonna murder me or something. I had this paranoid panic attack. Finally, I got to the point where I'm just yelling for my buddy. And he gets up, and he's in this state of confusion, just woken up out of a sound sleep in his underwear, just, what is it? And just to kind of ground myself, I asked him if I could give him a hug, and he just kind of grinned, said, all right. So I gave him a hug, and that kind of in a way, it just kind of settled everything. I knew that I could just feel just from, he was my brother, and so, there's not going to be any satanic cults or anything. Nobody's sacrificing me, anything like that. So it was all good after that. But that was about as close to a panic attack as I've ever had. And it was induced by excess of marijuana. And marijuana can notoriously make people feel paranoid. You just start worrying, what if this happens? That kind of thing. For me, it generally doesn't do that, but it can. It has in the past. With regard to chronic anxiety, I've never really heard of that, but extreme cases, you can have acute anxiety just caused by being way too high for your own good. So I guess I answered that question. So I'm just going to move on to Skaladin's third question, which is the very last question of the evening, or of the morning, the afternoon, whatever the hell time you are listening to this. And he says, do people still think that the people molding social norms are benevolent? And then he's got the bullet point that says, just a minute, I gotta blow my nose again. It's just that it's like some kind of valve up in my nostrils that keep closing off so that I can't breathe out through my nose to make certain sounds. It's not even funny. Anyways, the bullet point commentary says, I was listening to Yuri Bezmenov talk about how his nation functioned by throwing those who aren't 100% normie in the gulag, 30 million plus children. I can't say if the US will slide that low, but a similar persecution is happening to children. If they behave in a way that makes it difficult for a teacher, they are often misdiagnosed with mental illness or like ADHD or whatever, and doped up on prescription medication, sometimes purely for academic achievement, not to mention castrated males, is a thing now. Okay, let's just get back to the question. Do people still think that the people molding social norms are benevolent? I think most people, I mean, that's not even on the radar. A lot of people just think social norms just arise organically, spontaneously. And some of them do. I mean, every once in a while, just something will go viral. You know, some fashion, some trend will go viral, and people will just start liking it without anybody really planning it, you know, other than maybe the person who made the original YouTube video or whatever, that, you know, it just happens spontaneously. That there are, however, some social norms that are engineered, you know, by shady figures in the background, you know, by activists and lobbyists and all this, that, you know, some of it's by the government. Propaganda is really, I mean, my awareness of propaganda over the past several years is caused me to be very skeptical of history in general, because I doubt that the blatant propaganda just started when Donald Trump first ran for president in 2015. It's probably been there for a long time. It's just that something about Donald Trump makes people so hysterical and reckless that it's just made it just painfully obvious, to the point that Donald Trump, even though condemned as literally Adolf Hitler, won the popular vote in a mandate. So, do people, excuse me, do people still think that the people molding social norms are benevolent? Some do. Some think that they're all evil. But I would guess that for most people, it's just, they don't even think about it. You know, it's just social norms are just something that you accept. You know, it's just part of your environment. It's like trying to question, you know, what caused this social norm to arise. It's sort of like questioning what caused the weather to arise. It's just, what caused those clouds up there to arise? People just don't think about it. They just accept it as just the environment that's just handed to them as a given. It's just, you know, it's just something that you just have to work into the equation without having to wonder about where it came from. But, I mean, some social norms, I assume, may be benevolent. I mean, you got socialists who are trying to mold social norms in order to bring about some socialist utopia, even though like a century of stagnant and failed economies, totalitarianism and genocide is not sufficient evidence that socialism doesn't work. Well, at least Marxism doesn't. So, I mean, I guess the socialists who are coming up with the propaganda and all that aren't necessarily benevolent. They just kind of force socialism on everyone for somebody's own good, not necessarily ours, but somebody's. I mean, a lot of the like indoctrinated, college-educated white women who are going to vote Democrat no matter what, you know, they think that it's benevolent. They just assume that it is. I mean, they couldn't bring themselves to question the benevolence of whoever's coming up with ideas that are guiding the left nowadays. But I think there's a lot more black pilling and red pilling going on nowadays. So I think the percentage of people who think that propaganda is trustworthy and good are decreasing. So, yeah, but I do think that people are just waking up to the fact that really most of what passes for news, for example, is just propaganda. It may be that a lot of these news programs and like news channels, they'll take facts and then they will invariably twist it in favor of their own preferred narrative. And so, anything to do with Donald Trump, they're going to twist it into something negative. The right can take the exact same data and twist it into something good. So it's caused me to be a lot more skeptical. Like Trump's tariffs, very controversial nowadays. You got authorities on one side saying, it's about time, that this has been long in coming, it's necessary. And then then you got these other authorities, no less authoritative, saying it's going to destroy the American economy. And so, you just have to wait and see what's going to happen. It's kind of foolish to take a position when, you don't really know. But I think I'm wandering away from the people molding social norms and their supposed benevolence. Yeah, I think benevolence isn't really, in reality, it's not like the main ingredient in the motivation for molding social norms, that it's more like political convenience. So, but I think that people are gradually waking up in the West to this sort of thing. So some people still think that the people molding social norms are benevolent, but I would guess, like I started off saying, most people, they don't even think about it. It doesn't even occur to them to think about it. And that's it. We are done. And like I should always say at the beginning, and for some perverse reason, almost never do, if you have any questions that you think I could probably answer or possibly answer, especially about Theravada Buddhism, early Buddhism, Indian spirituality, like Eastern philosophy, Western philosophy, to some degree like classical literature. I haven't read a whole lot of obscure fringe stuff, but classical stuff I have read. Me personally, Burma, etc. And my metta goes out to the people whose world was shattered by the earthquake in Burma. One of my main supporters, I saw pictures of her school that just collapsed. The whole thing just caved in. A lot of buildings in central Burma are just brick buildings that do not tolerate 7.7 earthquakes very well. And I would guess that probably some of the temples of the ancient city of Pagan have collapsed too, but I haven't really seen any news about that. So I do hope that they bounce back from this like they bounce back from everything else. And no more than 3 questions per person per episode, please. And you can count questions by counting question marks. And aside from that, all else that I have to say to you is be happy.